Of people joining this afternoon session. Welcome to everybody. Thank you very much. As the last workshop of the day, I hope you've all gained a lot of information from the different workshops and the keynote speakers. Certainly they've been really interesting, the ones that I've been able to, lucky enough to see. This last workshop is all about getting advice from the NAHT in these challenging times. I'd like to introduce a panel now. So we have, and maybe they could do a quick waves in case people don't know who's who. So we have Guy Dudley, who is Head of Specialist Advice here at NAHT. We have Richard Shakespeare, who is the SEND Legal Specialist. And we have Rob Williams, who is the Senior Policy Advisor for NAHT. Thank you all of you for taking part today. This is an opportunity for all of us to be able to share and debate and discuss some of the issues school leaders are currently facing. Doesn't have to be COVID related, although I'm expecting it to be fairly weighted in that direction. You know, feel free to put things on chat. We're very on the chat part of Zoom. Very lucky to have Phil and Andy being our hosts, so they are doing all the clever stuff in the background, technical wise, so that if you have questions or want to participate, they can unmute and mute and do all sorts of things to help you. We will need to try and stay to time though, so it may be if we're getting towards the end, I pop up and just kind of say we've got a 5-minute time limit, but there is a short break afterwards before the closing speeches. So hopefully if there's a good debate going, then we can keep that going without having to break off straight off. So I'm going to hand over to Guy, who is the chair of the discussion, and hopefully look forward to hearing from lots of you and things that are going on for you in your schools. Thanks, Guy.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everybody. Hope you're all well and enjoying your time looking at this from home or your office. I just really wanted to sort of outline what we're going to go through, if that'll be helpful, so you know what's coming, and also just confirm that we have all got this on a paper for you, because I know everyone works in schools likes to have paper to take away from the meeting. And this is no exception. So what we'll aim to do, what the team at the NHT will do is, obviously they've got all your details, those people who are attending the meeting, and we'll email this out to you as quickly as possible after the meeting. So most of the detail that we're going to be talking about today is caught in that paper, including links to documents. So we're going to cover 4 sessions, four sort of fairly topical areas. I'm going to hand over to Rob Williams, my colleague, in a moment. Who's going to give us an update on COVID-19 and policy, and effectively what we're doing on your behalf, because I think it will be good to start off with a big picture. Then we're going to come down to Richard, Richard's one of the advisors, the specialist advisors in the advice team, many of whom you may have spoken to, and he's going to go through probably one of the most commonly asked questions at the moment. And it will probably become more common as we approach Christmas early. Can you bring the autumn term to an earlier close? Then Sarah's going to touch on pupil well-being and refer to a particular that's been written and that NHC have been co-authors of. And I know she's got details in front of her. That's why I put you third, Sarah, to make sure you got.
Thank you.
And then finally, and perhaps really relevantly for everyone that's listening, I'm going to talk about staff well-being. You know, it's an evergreen area, but I'm going to be giving you NAHT's take on it, so you can add that to what you already know. And one thing I would say is that this is your session. It's a dynamic session, so if any of you've got any questions, please pop them into the chat box. My colleagues, Phil and Andy, will be keeping an eye on that, and we can ask them and deal with them as we go along rather than leave them to the end. So any questions on any of the areas that we're covering, or even any that we're not covering, please do feel free to put your hand up using the little sort of hand signal, or pop a question into the chat box and it'll be dealt with thereafter. So hopefully those are the 4 areas we're going to be covering this afternoon, and as Sarah said, we'll aim for a 2:40 finish. Hope that's clear to everybody. Hope that's what you were expecting. I'm going to, on that note, hand over to my colleague, Rob. Over to you, Rob.
Thank you, Guy. Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be here today. I'm just going to quickly go through a few things around policy areas within SEND and the kind of things we've been looking at over recent months. Unsurprisingly, the main focus is all around COVID-19. I'm conscious also we may have people in from Wales and Northern Ireland. Clearly, there are devolved matters here. There'll be guidance in specific from all the devolved governments, England, Wales and Northern Ireland, have an ultimate aim of trying to keep children and young people in all year groups, in all setting types, for the rest of the autumn term. The government in England guidance for full opening of schools, which was last updated on the 26th of November, covers those expectations for children with special educational needs and disabilities and those children with an EHCP in mainstream schools. There is separate guidance as well, which was updated on the same date, which is also available in special schools, and that's specific guidance in other specialist settings. The guidance the government sets out the actions that they feel that school leaders should be taking to minimise the risk of transmission of COVID-19 in their settings. It highlights additional different considerations for special education settings compared to mainstream. It's public health advice. It's endorsed by Public Health England and is relevant for all specialist settings as intended. However, it must be said there are a number of areas still of uncertainty around this. Schools have varying amounts of space, both inside and out, for example, which can affect various things, including certain specific things like aerosol generating procedures, which I know were an issue when the guidance for that first came out. There's also challenges, particularly in the SEND sector, related to transport guidance. One of the frustrations we've had in guidance in general has been the timeliness, or rather the not untimeliness, of special school guidance from government, and I'll touch on that maybe a little bit later. But also the issues which you've heard in previous settings in the sessions in the conference today, around mental health and well-being, anxiety within families, which has affected the pupils' attendance at schools as well, which has also created further challenges for colleagues. It's fair to say that we've been talking to government constantly on your behalf around various areas. As I said, the timeliness of guidance, the relevance of it. Sometimes there have been issues that we fed into the all-party parliamentary group for SEND related to the guidance, and particularly around guidance was coming out, mainstream guidance was issued, and then special schools and specialist settings were then having to wait for their own guidance a little bit later. And we lobbied hard for that, to say that it all should be issued at the same time, because it created potentially further disadvantages for groups of children and young people and their families, and indeed you as school leaders, in trying to meet their needs in schools safely. Mental health and well-being has been mentioned, and I won't go too deeply into that because I know that's going to be picked up later by Guy. But also we've been doing a lot of work around that, because right at the beginning of the pandemic, many of our school leader members were highlighting this as a particular concern, particularly when schools, children were having to work remotely if they could possibly access that home. As we heard, it's a mixed picture in terms of how children have responded to that. Some have responded better than others. The idea that there will not be a need for support more widely as schools continue to manage this going forward is clearly an issue that the government needs to keep on top of. Talking of remote learning, there's been new guidance updated out today, and maybe this gives an indication really. It's guidance which has been updated only a matter of months, if that, after the original government guidance, which is a little bit of a concern when government themselves maybe lose faith in their own guidance in such a short time. And it really paints a picture of the challenges that you are facing at school level. We also have been looking at areas such as exceptional costs which are being faced by schools in this time, particularly within special schools. And recently we just had the announcement there will be some additional funding. It is a limited amount. It is not anywhere near what we were asking for, but we see it as progress towards it. It covers some staffing costs if certain criteria are met. And that is all available, I think will be on our website, and we've also issued it through our membership newsletters. I'm happy to take questions from that point onwards if anyone has any. Otherwise, if not, I'll be handing on to, I think, Richard.
Thanks, Rob. I think there's just a question in the chat from Kate Walker. As head teachers have been responsible for contact tracing these past few months, how can the NHT support head teachers to ensure a break at Christmas?
Really, really good question. It's something I know is really live. We picked this up back in half term because, of course, the same issues were happening then. I was speaking to a colleague literally this week who had had, I think, 5 consecutive weekends where they haven't had a break because they've had contact through track and trace, and they've had to then go through all the process of that. We're working hard with the DFE. I know that James Bowen, our head of policy, and others are talking to the DFE and to ministers around this. The DFE, I think it's fair to say, are really, really keen to try and find a solution. The challenge, of course, is particularly for the first 48 hours after schools finish at Christmas time, and for the children and young people that you support in your schools, they will be unable to explain exactly who they've been in contact with if there are diagnoses of COVID-19 as a result. I know that some local authorities are starting to put in place some support where they're looking to try and put in place other people to ensure that we get in place a break for staff and including school leavers, because we think it is essential. Many of you I know will have not had a break since probably February time at least, because you've worked through each of the breaks. All I can say at the moment is watch this space, because we are trying our hardest to make sure we can address this. It's an issue we see that needs to be addressed, and we are making it perfectly clear that all our school leaders, all our school staff and others desperately need some respite at Christmas if they're going to be ready to go in January, when that we'll still be in a similar situation to manage at school level.
I think the concern is, Rob, isn't it, that, and I've heard this from talking to members, that if somebody does contract a case of coronavirus just before the break, they're effectively going to be in isolation for the whole of the Christmas period. And I think that's going to be particularly tough because it will impact on families and their ability to come together. And I think that's the real driver for this. It's not to squeeze more time, it's to ensure that people can have a break that is of a period that exceeds the isolation period.
Absolutely. I mean, there's various ideas being sort of pushed around at the moment. I think we're just going to pick up this in an FAQ in a bit anyway, I think, about the early closing. So I won't go too much into that. But I know it is something that's absolutely live. What I can assure anyone listening to in on the call today is that NHT are absolutely on top of this, and our policy team are working incredibly hard to try and come up with a solution to make sure that all school staff get the break that they need.
Great. Thanks for that, Rob. That really, really helpful. And you know, as Rob says, I think we just need to keep watching this space. But I think there's a good segue into your the question, Rich, that I think has been burning some of the phones at the advice centre about the Christmas break, and you know, a lot of questions have been asked about whether head teachers can actually instigate an earlier closure. Could you expand on that for us?
Sure. Yeah, as colleagues will know, I mean, this particular issue was sort of got a national profile with, I think, the Focus Trust's attempt to close early, and obviously you probably are aware that the RSC and the DFE were expressed real concern. They had a lot of communication between the RSC and the Trust around this. And it's clear that the DFE is very unhappy with the idea that schools will be closing early, despite, in the case of the Focus Trusts, that they were intending to make up the time in the spring and summer terms. So As Rob has just alluded to, the policy team have been working very hard around this issue, and we can all understand why schools would want to close a little early. What we have been suggesting is that it will be very difficult because the DfE will challenge any decision to close early. It's obviously a very late in the day now, but there may well be, if anything, a question around the potential use of inset days to sort of abutting the holiday, using those at that particular point. Obviously, that would be done in consultation with parents, but that would seem to be the approach that might have some viability for some schools at this particular point.
Yeah, and if anyone has, thanks, Rich. I mean, if anyone has thought of or considered or is considering the use of inset days, perhaps I could just drop a note in the, if you don't mind being identified, perhaps you could drop us a note in the chat box just so we get there's a question from Kieran in the chat box, Phil, there. So if we do decide to close early and move to possibility of remote learning, will the DfE direct us to open, and will we receive support from the NAHT? Rob, you might want to chip in here, but my understanding is that the DfE expects schools to remain open insofar as we can, or they can. The NAHT's line is that we support that until we can persuade them to consider other options, which may include some flexibility, as Richard sort of suggests there, abutting the Christmas holiday. And presumably that's our position until we hear more, which is the sort of watch your space comment.
It is. I think it's worth noting that obviously there will be occasions when schools will be directed to do so if there are big outbreaks within schools, and I think that's possibly where the DfE will then be reluctant to do so preemptively at a school, if you like. But that doesn't stop the pressing that we're making at the moment in terms of the general point around this, which is we are conscious about the need for the break, and we are also conscious about managing those outbreaks for families so that there's no losing out to, say, over that Christmas period.
Yeah, and perhaps just on a final note on that question before we move to you. So, I mean, I think whilst the use of inset days are legitimate and could be used, it is perhaps, and it is a legitimate suggestion to use one or two of them. It's perhaps they're not perhaps being used for the original purposes they were intended for, which is professional development and learning among the profession. But I think, if needs must, then that could be a very legitimate option, and one that hopefully would get the agreement from parents and the employing body. Okay, thanks. I know that there's some questions coming in, but if we could just pause there, and perhaps Sarah, do you want to touch on the pupil wellbeing part?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, that's fine. Just on that point, though, I mean, I know from my school, and we're a generic special school, and most of our inset days are very much taken up with the statutory training that we have to do for care needs and health conditions of our more complex students. So if those inset days were to be used, that training would still need to take place, otherwise we wouldn't be compliant in health and safety. So it does cause it's a difficult balance, isn't it, to actually, we're looking at the safety and the well-being and mental health of staff, students and families, but also we have to remain health and safety and care compliant in order to have the students in who have got those extra needs. So it's a tricky old decision, and as the EDGE representative on the SEND Council, I'm actually quite relieved I'm not a head teacher right now. So, but moving on, enough about me. Moving on to the welfare of students. There is a lot of information out there. The NAHT have worked really hard with a many different mental health charities, including Place to Be, Young Minds, the Anna Freud Centre for Children and Families, and the PSHE Association, to come up with some guidance which is really useful for looking at the return to school, how to support students who have got additional levels of anxiety, if there's been family bereavements, or if there's even been bereavements within the school community. So that, if you haven't downloaded that yet, then the information sheet that you'll get from this discussion session has a link to that. So it's well advised. I know I've got a lot of information from that when I looked at it earlier this term. I mean, I think the key point is that actually, as schools, as staff in schools, we know our students, and it's very easy to say this, but we know those students who are going to be having greater issues. We know the students who are going to need greater levels of support, and it's about communicating that with the wider community, so external agencies, so that when you are dealing with students in crisis, that actually as staff you are also okay and being supported in that, because it can cause, secondary trauma is actually quite can have a significant impact on mental health and well-being as well, and actually how you then help students. So I think, and I know from personal experience that coming back to school full time and starting to implement back the curriculum that we were doing pre-COVID had to be put on hold for quite a while, and we just needed to work with the students on their social and emotional well-being to start with. Before any learning could take place, we have to have students in a place where they're ready to learn before we can start going into English, maths, science, IT, geography, history, RE, all those subjects. Sorry for those I've missed. They have to be able to access their thinking brain before they can do anything else, and that I think is key. And those resources that are on the help sheet that will come are really good at explaining that.
Thanks, Sarah. Just to remind people, the 2-pager that's going to be emailed out to you will have links to the guidance that Rob mentioned. We'll have the answer to the question that Richard dealt with, and we'll have the report, a link to the report. It's 16 pages long, but like lots of these academic reports, it's only about sort of 8 pages, with 4 pages of introduction and 4 pages of sort of acknowledgement reference guides. So actually it's quite a short read. It's probably a half-an-hour read, and I think because of the credibility of the contributors, and Place to Be are the NHT's chosen charity for the 2nd year running now, and with the others that were mentioned by Sarah, especially the Anna Freud Centre. It really is a very credible piece of writing, and probably the sort of most definitive bit of guidance out there for you. So I'd really encourage, once you've got this email that will be sent to you later, click on the link and have a good read. It's probably got everything you need to have in there. So thank you, Sarah. That's really helpful. Is there any questions? I mean, if there are any questions, we've got a couple of other questions, I think, Phil, in the chat box. Phil's obviously not with us.
Here. I'm here. So the question is from Fiona. Can I ask what the NHT expectation is of schools being called to be directly involved in the distribution of the COVID winter grant allocation?
That's probably something I may turn to my learned colleague, Rob, to comment on.
You said the word learned, Guy. I didn't think it was going to apply to me, to be honest.
I qualified it.
Thank you, you did. I know that the COVID winter grant is an allocation in England, but actually there's devolved funding also to North Wales and Northern Ireland, so it's one across the board here. When you look at the government guidance on it, it's specifically that, in my interpretation of it, it specifically talks about the responsibility sitting on councils. What it may mean is that schools will be asked to help with the pulling together of information prior to it taking place, but councils should be aware and have that information really already. So the question talking about direct involvement, my interpretation of that is there cannot be any expectations on schools to have to be involved in that distribution. I think one of the dangers that came out of the way in which schools stepped up so well to the plate over the lockdown, schools stepped into the gap with lots of things, including health and social care over that period, because they wanted to do the right thing and they wanted to look after their community as best as they possibly can, as they always do. I think one of the issues that we've been calling for particularly is for health and social care particularly, and in this respect, councils to step back into the space where they need to, because it is ultimately a responsibility they need to pick up. And whilst schools can sometimes do that in an emergency situation, this has now been in place for a significant length of time, and really that schools can't be expected to fill the gaps of others. And I think this is a case where the responsibility sits squarely at council levels. If you look at the government site around this, it talks about councils. In fact, the sentence like I will read you, it is why they will distribute the funds, councils, rather than schools, who will continue to provide meals for disadvantaged children during term time. So it's been quite clear in the guidance on the website too. Hopefully that answers your question.
Great, thank you, Rob. And then there was one more, Andy or Phil, from Kieran again, or I think it was a comment that we could respond to. Sorry, Phil, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think just a comment from Kieran regarding the early conversation. The hours could be used for several twilight sessions across the year.
Yeah, I think, I mean, guess this goes back to the sort of the example there of the focus all to go public in the decision to close early. What wasn't reported in certainly the headlines I read was that although they had made that decision, and it was a bold one, that they had intended to make that time up across the remainder of the academic year. So all they're looking to do is shuffle the pack rather than reduce the pack of hours. And I think that was an important point lost, perhaps not newsworthy than the actual decision itself. But I think, you know, if any school has appetite for that, whether or not they use inset days or some sort of flexible hours, I think if they're going to put any case together, it would be more preferable and therefore advisable to ensure that the parents, the governors and the employing body, if they're not one and the same thing, actually recognise that it would be your intention to make those hours up. So in one way, shape or form, so that there is not a loss of directed teaching time or inset days or any other ingredient, but there could be a little bit of flexibility and reshuffling of the pack. And I guess, Kieran, that's what your question was getting to, or my interpretation of your question as well. And if it wasn't, let me know. Great. Well, I think we'll carry on answering questions as they come in, and I know Phil and Andy are on standby to pick those up. Thank you, Kieran. Just an acknowledgement that my understanding was correct there. Right. Well, I guess this is the bit that is going to be important to everybody on the call, including Sarah and probably the three of us, or the five of us at the NAHT. Well-being. God, where do you start with well-being? It's one of those subjects that not even professors and people who lecture on it can actually agree what it is. And I've gone out with lots of colleagues over the years, 7 years I've been with the NHT, and given talks and presentations on well-being. Possibly one or two of you in the audience have been at the end of come to one of those talks, but I thought I'd boil it down to 6 points. And again, these are made on the paper that's coming out after the session today. And I'm pleased that we've got perhaps a good run at this, perhaps perhaps half an hour or so. The points I want to make are leadership, what the law says, policy, practice, validate, perception, the 3 Ps, policy, practice, perception, and health. But I'll start with leadership. I know it sounds rather corny, but most things that start off in schools and last and are sustainably successful start with leaders setting an example, setting the bar for whatever they may want to be achieving at any one time. And there are generally 2 types. There are ones that are authentic and ones that probably would be accused in the less kind moments of paying lip service to well-being. And where I've seen well-being implemented incredibly well in schools and having positive results and outcomes for staff retention, staff engagement, communication, and therefore pupil progress, is where there is really authentic leadership. So when leaders of schools talk about well-being, they mean it, and more importantly, they're seen to be meaning it as well. People believe them. And you know, I think you've probably recognized that in yourself if you're a leader, or in your leader if you're not. I think you probably recognize the degree of authenticity of leaders, because without that authentic belief and commitment to well-being, it's likely to have a relatively short shelf life. Where some people can't commit to it isn't a lack of necessarily willing or ability, it's understanding. They don't quite understand what well-being is and what well-being manifests itself into on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's really important that leadership get it. And if they don't get it, people work with them to ensure that they do get it. And even if that involves them calling us, we can talk them through it. That would be enormously helpful. You may or may not know, the second bit I'd like to talk about is the law and what statute says. You may or may have heard, may not or may not have heard of a document called the STPCD. It's an acronym that I became very familiar with when I joined, probably my first day of joining the NHT 7 years ago. It stands for the School Teachers Pay and Conditions document. You can just Google it and it's in the public domain. The reason I'm mentioning this is this actually sets out your lawful entitlement to breaks. And there's probably a few gasps that I can't hear, that people say, you know, people don't recognize that they're actually entitled legally to breaks in the day. Whether or not they get them and whether or not they take them and use them for the purposes for which they're in, you are entitled to a break. The other issue to mention is the Health and Safety at Work Act, which is pretty much the sweeping legislation, been around for many, many years now, almost 50 years, that says all health and all workplaces must be healthy and safe for people to work in. And it goes beyond cleanliness, it goes into all the morality of safety, safe working spaces. And then you've got your employment contract and what's called the implied duty of care. It's an implied contractual duty because it's not written into the contract. Therefore, it's implied that your employer, whoever that may be, will exercise a duty of care to you in terms of workload, safety. So if it's not in the law, the Health and Safety at Work Act, it's in the STPCD, which is the sort of little bit of practice that covers the teaching. It's the sort of Bible that covers the teaching profession, and it's in your contract. So it is actually there for you The reason it's there is to protect you, so that you can rely on it in the event that there are breaches of those particular aspects of your employment. The third area is policy. Many of your schools will have flexible working policies, will have home working policies, or what are often called occasional home working policies, where you might be permitted to work from home on at particular times of year, working on specific projects. And of course, one thing I've learned in my number of years at the NHT is that people love that variety, love that flexibility, but everything goes back to the authenticity of the leader. If the leader can trust you, and often that's something that may be missing in certain establishments, they may well trust you to work from home and work flexibly, and its enormous benefits that it provides outweighs any cost or other consideration. So I think, you know, we've touched on leadership. We've touched on what's there to protect you in terms of the law and your contract, your employment contract, and in terms of the school teacher's terms and conditions document. Worth a look at if you can bear to read the 83 pages. But believe me, the working time part of it is quite a short section. Touch upon our practice, and perhaps these are the ones that mean more to people on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes head teachers will call us, and no doubt Richard's spoken to a few, and Rob, you have too, where they try and bring well-being, staff well-being, into practice, and they struggle. Head teachers in particular struggle with, well, how do I do that? What are the day-to-day machinations in a school where I can effectively make that happen? Well, one of them is in performance management. It's not uncommon these days for head teachers in their school, especially if an audit of well-being, which I'll touch on in a moment, has highlighted a few red flag areas, and an enlightened governing body may be very receptive to agreeing to a set of performance management objectives for the head teacher, one of which would be related to well-being. The other area, of course, you can touch on in performance management, whether you're being performance managed or you're performance managing somebody, is workload. People often talk about the various parts of work they're doing, but they don't necessarily look at it as a whole. And I think, you know, once you begin to look at performance management holistically rather than by objective, you may get a better sense of the workload that that person is experiencing. I've never heard a case of in 7 years of people not having enough work. It's always the other end of the scale of too much work. Meetings is another one. So many head teachers and NAHT members call us and say, you know, our meetings are very much used to inform us of certain things. We have a lot of them during the week. They take up a lot of time, and most of them are unnecessary. Well, I'll come back to this in a moment in the perception part, but again, looking at your meetings structure could be particularly helpful in making sure that you make the most use of the week. Inset days, very few people that I've spoken to over the last 12 months have had inset days where well-being is their theme. It tends to be around professional practice rather than the human being, rather than the member of staff. And a final suggestion on the practice part is suggestion box. These can sit in staff rooms if you have them, or around the school, and be particularly good places for people to raise issues that may be important to them or may be of relevance to the school and how it conducts itself. The two final points I'd make are, and perhaps this is where, you know, these aren't in any particular order, but I struggle with putting this one at the top or the bottom. There's a lot of talk in wellbeing circles of validate perception. What we mean by that is doing a staff audit. Again, it would be interesting by a show of sort of, you know, virtual hands, how many people have actually carried out or been the subject of a wellbeing staff audit. If you don't know something, and often school leaders are caught in that sort of a rabbit in headlights when it comes to wellbeing, ask the staff. Do a staff audit. Take the temperature of the school. One of the more common outcomes of that is that you can then establish a focus group amongst staff that look at well-being and have well-being as its effective terms of reference. You can also develop from that focus group a policy and a variety of practices. And Ofsted are increasingly looking at how schools are looking to tackle well-being, and giving it a mention in dispatches occasionally won't be enough for a determined Ofsted inspector. They will want to see what practice have you put in place to ensure well-being of staff and pupils. So I think this one is the staff audit, the focus group, and then the focus group can be set a target to develop a policy and practices, or if you've got one, to review it in light of what we've talked about so far. Last but not least, wellbeing is often driven by morality. It's often driven by someone wanting to become more popular. Someone want to put a tick in a box. The other big driver, of course, and we've seen it increasingly over years with sickness absence levels not really going down, and in some cases going up for a variety of reasons, is one of which is stress, is to commission the NHS to come in and do a workplace health assessment. Now, we all know that the NHS is stretched at the moment, but again, this could be a particular outcome for a policy or your practices or your focus group. I went on an NHS workplace health assessment in my previous employer, and you know, it became a little bit life-changing. And I was, you know, being put on a particular type of medication without which, you know, my life wouldn't have been as comfortable. So, you know, I think it's really worth considering whether or not in your school health is a particularly relevant driver of well-being, and an NHS workplace health assessment is very where a team of nurses will come in and effectively sheep dip you in their testing in their testing areas of blood pressure, height, weight, etc., with a view to then agreeing a plan with you to improve your health. And last but not least, your employer is more likely to have than not what's called an employee assistance program, or an EAP, as their acronym suggests. And these are programs often available through your HR team, or possibly mentioned in your staff benefits section of your contract, made up of all sorts of professional counsellors to help people in other ways that an NHS professional couldn't. So that may be with psychological, mental health, debt finance, alcoholism, drug taking, anything else that you may want to encourage people to take advantage of. The employer pays them, so there's no cost to the employee at all, and it's free and entirely confidential. So again, if you've got an employee assistance program, could an outcome of any staff intervention be to raise awareness of it? If you haven't got an employee assistance programme, could an outcome of a staff audit or policy or practice be to have one? So I think leadership, what's there to legally protect you, what policies are already in place, what practices are already in place, validate the perception through a staff audit, establish a focus group, develop a policy and practices, and take a look at well-being through a health lens rather than any of the above lenses. And I think those 6 areas are likely to give you more traction in well-being than not. The beauty of it is that a lot of it is already in place and people don't know it because they haven't put the time aside, which is the biggest enemy in any school I know. I've spent 7 years experiencing it's never commitment, it's never being shy of workload. It is purely having the time to do this. But I think it's about time, and this current pandemic is something that should teach us all a lesson that we need to make time for well-being in our own lives and the lives of others that we work with and work for. So I hope that's a reasonable whistle-stop tour. All of those points and suggestions are in the paper that will be coming out to you shortly after the meeting. And you know, by all means, if you need to get back in touch with us, I hope you know where to find us. Are there any? I haven't enlarged my screen to see if there's any. I'm just doing so now. Any questions at all on that we could deal with? But I'm not sure there are.
No questions at the moment, in there, Guy?
Are there, I mean, certainly people might be typing as we speak. If there are any other questions relating to Rob's area policy, Sarah's area, the pupil wellbeing today, Richard's on all things related to send, certainly in the mainstream settings, please fire away.
So I've got a response to the question about wellbeing activities that people are putting together in schools. One person is doing a secret friend. It's a bit like Secret Santa. Everyone completed a form and a questionnaire about their likes and dislikes and what makes them smile. Each week something arrives on our desks from our secret friend. Simple, but can be very uplifting on those days. Right.
Okay. That's. In fact, I think that was an idea that was in the report, Sarah.
Yes. I mean, it's that it really. I mean, it does. It does. I had a box of Maltesers on my desk when I arrived at school the other day, and I cried with happiness. One, because it was chocolate, but two, because I knew somebody had thought about me, and so it makes an incredible difference just having those little tokens. And it doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be even cost any money. But I think sometimes it's really good to be able to support the colleagues, noticing colleagues, listening to colleagues. There's quite a fine line sometimes, I think, between and it's a difficult one to balance, but I think particularly maybe middle leaders, where staff come and will vent or moan about something, and then you take that forward as an issue, and then it turns out it was just a bit of a vent and a moan, and the people feel fine because they vented at you. So there has to be time for listening, and there has to be time for, you know, then, well, what can we do? What can you do to make things better or to change things? We implemented a wellbeing steering group last year, which has been really successful. So we're a generic special. I work in a generic special school. So there's staff volunteered from each area of school, because obviously the different need groups mean that there are different priorities and different issues and different difficulties within the daily work of the school, and we meet termly or half-termly to discuss things, to bring things together, and that's where, rather than a suggestion box, that's where our suggestions come. And it's a very solution-focused group. So from that, we've had school do a reduced rate of, not during lockdown unfortunately, but reduced rate of massage, because we had a lot of staff who were getting back and shoulder problems. We have reduced the number of meetings. We've looked at workload, not just the paperwork side of things, but also the emotional side of things, and kind of the social care side of things, which is a huge part, an area of our schooling. So all those things that you listed then, Guy, are really practical and useful things to do.
I think, Andy.
I'm putting an actual hand up, not a virtual one. I just came on to say I sat in on the 2 sessions that Barry Carpenter ran this morning, and that really focused on well-being on a very practical level, and talked about things like happiness boxes, you know, that kids can make, and there were lots of practical advice and guidance in there, and links to resources. So obviously we'll put the links around to those sessions. So if you didn't catch Barry this morning, we'll send that around, and people can have a look at his presentation from this morning. I think that really touches on well-being.
Great, thanks, Andy. Yeah, I think it's you know, I think it's one of those sort of intangible areas, isn't it, well-being? And I think it's, you can't touch it, you can't buy it. It's not a product or a service. It comes from the heart, and I think it comes from the top, but it also comes from the bottom as well. You know, I think there's got to be a sort of slight cultural shift in lots of schools that effectively recognise that actually they're only as good as the people in them, and our lots of recent reports of, you know, that we've published. Certainly, our latest school improvement report has sort of come up with that. It's not old, it's not new. It's been around for years. I think what people need to do now is really, if this pandemic hasn't put well-being on the agenda, I'm not sure whether there will ever be anything. And no one's cracked it. It's not meant to be cracked, but it's meant to be there, and it's meant to be sustainable in schools. And I think I really hope that as Barry Carpenter's sessions and the sort of half a dozen points that we put there, and as Sarah said, most of these things are really practical and don't require a lot of effort. They just require a shift in how people approach their work. And you'll find it's actually very straightforward to do. In lots of schools I've known have done it. She said, I don't know why we didn't do this several years ago, because it's hardly taken any effort at all, but it has taken some effort. And of course it will. So I don't think...
I've got one question here. It was just whether each of the panellists, I think I'm minded of a comment I heard the other day about tired leaders making tired decisions. And I think one of the key things with well-being is being able to be in a position to be able to put those things into action. So I wondered if each of the panellists would just give us one top tip for leaders' own personal well-being.
Yeah, well, ladies first, Sarah.
I was going to go last. I mean, it's really important, I think, to try and lead by example, and it's in a leadership position, you are wanting to do the best for your colleagues, for your staff, and so from my point of view, personally, and I'm reminded of this regularly by my head teacher, is that it's self-care. So giving myself time to sit and have a cup of tea and watch something rubbish on the telly, because the work is going to be there the next day, and if it's not done by a certain time, then you pick it up in the morning. So I think it's about allowing yourself to have some space, because we're all human.
Thank you. Rob and Richard. Rob, I'll go to you. I mean, if people don't know, both Rob and Richard have led schools before. So if anyone should have some good advice, they should. So what's your pearl of wisdom, Rob?
I'm building on really what Sarah was saying. I worked in primary education for 24 years. I was a head for 10, deputy head for 6 before that. I think one thing I saw in a presentation, which is quite a stark way of putting it, but it was you don't need to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. And it's about this concept of setting the tone. One of the things we did in one part in Wales with NHTs, we did a short pilot which was assessing the stress levels of head teachers, where they wore heart rate variability monitors for a week. I suggest we wouldn't repeat that at the moment. But the results even then were really, really stark and worrying. And what was clear there was actually all the people who participated, all the heads were saying, and actually that was an ordinary week. There was nothing that happened that was out of the ordinary. And what was clear was the connection for heads with heads as well. Sometimes that need to talk to somebody who understands your role really, really well. And it can be an isolating role. It can be particularly challenging if you're in a rural or isolated area. And having those connections is really important. And the whole school aspect of that, understanding that your governing body or your trust or whoever looks out for you as a leader have a responsibility to look after your well-being as well, and to understand what that means, and to have some practical things in place for that too. Because there was a report I remember back in 2008 that talked about the mental health and well-being of children, and saying you can't deal with stressed children and young people if you're putting in front of them stressed teachers, and the same thing happens with leaders, I suggest.
Great, thank you. And Richard, your pearl of wisdom for leaders.
I think I would say that you should share your issues and the burdens that you hold, and the decisions that you have to make. And obviously, I feel that NAHT might have a part in that. The advice team is available with people who are deeply experienced in all areas across, from HR to inspections to behaviour, all areas, pensions even. And if you've got an issue or a question that you'd like to just discuss through with someone, then call us on 0300 30 30 333, option 1, or get in touch via email at specialistadvice@naht.org.uk, and we'll arrange a mutually convenient time to discuss it.
Thank you. And just in case you're thinking, no, I didn't put Richard up to that. That was completely an independent act, as I've come to expect from Richard. But thanks, Rich. No, I think you're absolutely right. You know, don't do all the heavy lifting. You have a senior leadership team if you're a school leader. You know, if you're a teacher, you should have, you know, colleagues that can support you. My advice is to get enough sleep. It's amazing how, when we've talked about well-being at workshops, how people feel that after a good night's sleep, they're ready to tackle anything, and they relish tackling most things. That's why they go into teaching and head teaching. They don't do it because they're shrinking violets. They do it because they want to make a difference, and they're not afraid of hard work. But I would genuinely say, it's not a flippant remark at all, if you're not sleeping properly, that should be a red flag, and perhaps you need to adjust your routines in the evening. But believe me, 9 times out of 10, one of the top tips that keep coming out of wellbeing sessions wherever I've had them is get enough sleep, because if you're refreshed in the morning, you feel able to take the world on, and that's what you do every day, and thank goodness you do. So on that positive prophetic note, I shall pass back to you, Sarah, just to